Over the past few months, you've probably heard that almost everyone, me included, has tried to make sourdough bread during all the spare time we found ourselves with. If you haven't tried making it for yourself, you probably don't know why it's such a long and time-consuming process, or you may be curious as to why this type of bread is described as sour. Most recipes for baking bread require yeast, as this is a rising agent which helps form the light and airy texture that we all love. The difference between sourdough and any other loaf of bread is the source of the yeast used. We can now buy yeast from supermarkets in foil packets. However, before any of this existed, people cultured yeast themselves and kept it alive by making something we now know as starter. The process of making sourdough bread comes from a centuries-old method of preserving and storing yeast for long periods of time. Many historians believe that the ancient Egyptians were the ones to discover that yeast could be produced using only flour and water. While this type of bread has been around for centuries, the name sourdough came to be during the late 1800s, during the California gold rush. Before heading off to work in the mountains, miners would obtain supplies from the nearby town of San Francisco, and a good bread starter would be essential. The starters produced in that area were particularly tangy, and so the bread made became known as sourdough. Nowadays, any bread which requires yeast to be cultivated at home rather than using a pre-packaged form is known as sourdough bread. San Francisco has many bakeries and cafes selling sourdough loaves, and it's still very popular in the city. In fact, many bakeries in the area sell pre-made sourdough starters, so people can cut straight to the bread making process if they'd like. As long as it's maintained in the correct way, starter can keep alive and well forever, and many people pass on their own starter to friends and family to use in their own sourdough loaves. Sourdough bread is made from the same basic ingredients as any other loaf, the most important ones being flour and yeast. Most bread is made from wheat flour, because this forms a stretchy substance called gluten. Kneading dough allows for the gluten to form long, thread-like chains that trap carbon dioxide in, eventually creating the tiny holes which give the bread a light and airy texture. Yeast works by breaking down the starches in wheat flour to form sugar, which is known as fermentation. Yeast is the leavening agent in bread, which is what makes it rise. When yeast is bought in a packaged form, it's been suspended, dried, and preserved, and then made into a powder. The water is added to reactivate it, and finally it's added to the bread mixture. However, starter is a liquid that keeps yeast fungi alive constantly, requiring it to be fed and maintained correctly to stay active. This starter is what gives the bread its distinctive, tangy taste. The yeast uses carbohydrates from wheat flour to produce ethanol and carbon dioxide, and the ethanol is then further converted by bacteria found in the starter to produce lactic acid. This acidity is great for yeast, but it's inhospitable for other organisms, so it actually acts as a naturally forming preservative. So how do you make it? To begin, mix equal parts in water and flour in a preferably glass container. Typically around 100 grams flour and 100 ml of water is used. Then cover the bowl using a tea towel or cloth, and keep your starter in a warm environment, as yeast thrives in higher temperatures. Mark the level of the starter mixture with tape, a rubber band, or a pen mark, so you can later determine whether it's risen or not. You and your starter are going to be spending a lot of time together from now on, so give them a name. Some of my personal favourites are Vincent Van Dough and Little Bread Rising Hood. After 24 hours, check to see the state of your starter. It should have risen quite significantly, and there should also be small bubbles forming on the top. If it hasn't risen, don't worry, just move it to a slightly warmer place and leave it for another 24 hours. If it has risen, that's great. You can now feed your starter. The first step of feeding is to discard half of your starter. Yeah, you heard me right, you throw half of it away. This may seem like a waste, and it is, but because the yeast in starter is active, it's constantly growing and expanding. If we don't discard some of it, it will very quickly grow to a point where it's unmanageable for home baking, and eventually you'll have to have an entire fridge reserved for only sourdough starter. If you don't want to just throw this into the bin, which is understandable, There are many recipes available online for incorporating this excess starter into food such as pancakes and waffles. To feed the remaining starter, you should incorporate equal parts of flour and water like before. You can use a bit less this time. I found that 50 grams of flour and 50 ml of water works well. Mix this thoroughly and then leave your starter again for 24 hours. This process should be repeated for the next 7 days. Check the starter to see if it's risen. If it has, discard half and feed it again. If it hasn't, move it to a warmer place and then wait another day. By day 7, your starter should be ready to make bread. You can check if it's ready by smelling it. It should be very slightly sweet, but also have a strong alcohol-like scent. Another way to determine if it's ready is to take a spoon and scoop a bit of starter off the top of the bowl. Place this dollop into a glass of water. If it floats, you're definitely ready to make a sourdough loaf. If it doesn't, don't worry, carry on with the feeding process for another few days and check regularly for these telltale signs. While cultivating your starter, you may see some other things happening to your mixture. If you go to check on your mixture and find a layer of murky looking brown liquid on the top, don't worry, this is known as hooch, and it's the alcohol given off if the yeast ferments. If this forms, all it means that your starter needs feeding, so get rid of the hooch and feed your starter accordingly. However, if you find that your starter has formed black or blue coloured bits on the top, it's definitely gone off, and unfortunately you'll need to start the process again. This is unlikely though, and if looked after well, your starter is likely to never form this. The hard part of sourdough bread making is complete. You now have 2 options. You can make the bread using a recipe that works for you. Experiment with adding flavours and herbs as well if you'd like, but sourdough itself has quite a distinct taste. There are loads of different ways to make your loaf. I recommend the recipes from BuzzFeed Tasty and BBC Good Food. You can also check out Paul Hollywood's Guide to Making a Starter, in which he interestingly uses an apple to aid the fermentation process. If you don't want to make bread immediately, you can preserve the starter to make it whenever you want. To do this, store the starter in a sealed glass container like an old jam or pasta sauce jar, and then put this in the fridge. The cold environment will slow down the yeast growth, so it can stay alive with a lot less maintenance. All you need to do is check every 7 days or so for signs of hooch forming, and then feed it as normal. Leave this in a warm environment for 24 hours and then put it back in the fridge. If it still seems like a lot of effort, remember sourdough isn't easy. You can always gift the remainder to a friend or family member if they're interested in making sourdough. Or you can make your starter so you only have enough to make 1 or 2 loaves of bread at once. Sourdough bread recipes usually call for around 100 grams of starter, so you can measure your ingredients to make it accordingly if you're just doing a one-time bake. You now know the science and history behind sourdough starter, so why not have a go at making your own loaf? It may seem like a lot of work, but in the end, it's worth it. If you're interested in any of the recipes I mentioned earlier, please check the episode notes below for links, and otherwise have fun in your bread baking adventure, and good luck!